Welcome back to another episode of Reading Rehab. I'm Mike Brown, joined by,
Brian Gardner.
And Pat Healy.
and this week we are talking about tendon stress and strain. The article is No Strain, No Gain, the Role of Strain and Load Magnitude in Human Tendon Responses and Adaptation to Loading. This was written by a single guy, Gerard McMahon, in Ulster University in Northern Ireland. So we appreciate you. This came out in 2022. And it's just a review of essentially the biggest thing I got from this was like good definitions of tendon strain, stress, stiffness, and Young's modulus, which happened in the introduction. So I guess just going through those, tendon strain is the elongation of the tendon relative to the normal length. He says normal length, I just think resting length. Tendon stress is the force relative to the cross-sectional area. Stiffness is the change in length relative to the force applied, which is dependent on cross-sectional area and the length of the tendon. In Young's modulus is the relationship between stress and strain, and it is he says, representing the properties of the actual tendon material independent of the cross-sectional area, which especially those last two were pretty helpful for me because I had heard of both stiffness and Young's modulus, but I wasn't entirely sure the difference between the two of them. So that was helpful.
I think we talked about Young's modulus prior in a previous episode.
I know we've talked about it before, but I've always been like, what exactly is this?
Yeah. No, I appreciate it as well. I mean, just kind of lays down definitions for each one because, again, a lot of this can be like people think it's like the same thing where stiffness and strain kind of you'd think it'd be the same, but it's really not.
Yeah. But that was honestly the main thing I got from the introduction, potentially also like the depiction of the stress strain curve, which is primarily figure 1 too, because he described it in words, but I really was not following with words. So it was much easier to see what he was talking about in figure 1. So figure 1 is essentially showing that like there's minimal adaptation to the tendon with less than like 4, maybe a little, like it's like 3.9 percent tendon strain, and then you can quickly get a lot of adaptation in the like 4.5 to like 6 and a bit range of tendon strain, and then after that, like percentages, these are all percentage of tendon strain. After that, then you just get the likelihood of rupture, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I like that they also overlaid the percent MVC / percent 1RM too. I think that's a good way to kind of to look at it too, because again, that's something that we have the capability of utilizing versus like trying to figure out tendon strain percentage just in sort of an outpatient orthopedic realm. You probably won't have access to deciding how much strain is going through the tendon.
Yeah. And they also like overlaid there too is this the concept they have of like if you have less muscle strength but more tendon stiffness, there will be less tendon strain at similar MVC or 1RM. So like they just have a line going down from 70%. If you are not as strong but have a stiffer tendon, I think about this as like someone post-op Achilles repair, which there is also other considerations for that as well. But in theory, you kind of want the tendon to be a little stiffer to help with the healing process. There may not be as much tendon strain, so as much like deformation of the tendon at 70% 1RM. But if you are stronger and have more tendon compliance, then you could get a large amount of tendon strain. The tough part is, as we talked about briefly off air, is like then you need to individualize, like you need to know what your tendon compliance is, which is just not possible or not feasible clinically. Yeah.
Guesswork, baby.
Yeah. Essentially what I take from this is like 70% 1RM can be pretty good for tendons.
Yeah, like that's kind of the only deduction that can come from this. I feel like where if you cannot see the internal strain that's happening, you kind of have to go with whatever the evidence that they presented with earlier, which kind of highlighted that just higher reps of 1RM to a degree are going to be more beneficial for increasing tendon strain and adaptation.
One thing that I was just thinking about that I'm curious how it changes this figure and just like how we would approach tendon loading. Because they have decreased muscle strength, increased tendon stiffness, or increased muscle strength and increased tendon compliance. What if you have decreased muscle strength and increased tendon compliance? Like I think about someone with like a hypermobility syndrome that doesn't do any sort of like strength training or anything. I wonder what that would look like. Potentially that could be a indication for some low load, like purely if you're just trying to get a tendon adaptation. This could be different for muscular, but it could be an indication for a low load resistance. So then you still get relatively high tendon strain, but don't risk like too much tendon strain, if that makes sense.
I see what you
I don't
mean.
know.
I think it comes down to it's going to be harder to judge that like internal morphology change when I think you get into realms like what you just discussed, Mike. Like I think based on what's presented with the two layouts that they have, where it's like if there's decreased muscle strength but increased tendon stiffness, you probably are okay doing this. And if you have the opposite, where it's like increased muscle strength and increased tendon stiffness, doing higher loads. But then when you get into the realm of where like all things are, more compliant, less muscle strength, I think it starts to become even more gray of like, well, are we just going to be increasing all because this is like starting at such a low floor and their ceiling is potentially just always going to go up,
Yeah.
Tough to say. Tough to
Yeah.
say.
I mean, they do talk about BFR at the end of this, some randomly thrown in. So I don't know
Just
if that
put it in there, baby. Get it in there.
I don't know if that's something that could be in the mix with that. Obviously, just having that as an option could be beneficial for those types of individuals. They do say it helps with Achilles stiffness. But then they go on to say that the stiffness in the muscle tendinous aponeurosis was higher with the higher load versus the low load MBFR group. So again, all controversial. There's lots more that, and he kind of concludes that this just needs more research for BFR. So that's kind of where you could look at it from. You're saying low, like the floor is very low. Like, again, probably not going to put 80% of 1RM on someone that has, I guess, a muscular disease or something that's hypermobile. But this may be another option clinically.
Yeah, I thought at one point, I'm trying to find it now, but I thought the BFR piece was interesting, because at one point he says like that tendons are relatively avascular, so in theory you wouldn't really expect much adaptation from BFR to this, to the tendon, which I just thought was fun. Also, like in theory, with lower loads you wouldn't get as much strain, or yes, as much strain for it, unless you're working in longer, or like in certain joint angles where you do have like start in a relatively stretched position. That was one. Oh, you go.
I was gonna say the take of how saying that tendons are mostly avascular and then the BFR wouldn't do too much, that kind of I guess confused me, because in my mind it's like you get this metabolic metabolic just I don't want to say pocket, I can't think of a better word, but
Cascade.
thank you. Yeah, the like metabolic cascade, you're essentially trapping all these metabolites in the limb, distal from the BFR cuff. Well, how is it that it has to be vascular for it to like get those benefits? If like, I don't know, unless I'm just like not good with, physiology, but I feel like it's all
Because
circling around.
where would the metabolites be trapped? I guess I'm going like the
I see what you
metabolites
mean. Yeah.
would be in the vascular structures, unless they like are at the capillaries as well, and then they like go out into tissue through the capillaries, which is possible. But I feel like the majority of the metabolites, now I'm just totally spitting, I don't actually know if this is the case, but my guess would be the majority of the metabolites would be in the blood, so you have to have a good vascularity in the tissues to be able to get the metabolites there in the first place.
Okay.
But I don't know.
Take your word for it on that one.
Yeah, I'm 50% convinced.
Yeah. Yeah. To one thing that I also took from this too. So like, I guess before going into too much more, I thought it was interesting. So this was a review. So there is one potential for bias because he can just choose whatever articles he wants to support his thesis. But most of this was just like talking about specific articles, like what each article found, and then there was like a couple sentence paragraph at the end of each thing that was like, taken together these things suggest X thing. And I was like, I personally wish that most of the article was just like that last paragraph, where like it's nice to know the specifics of each article, but I want to know like everything in aggregate. That's why I'm reading the review and not reading all the specific articles. But maybe I'm just being mean.
Damn, really getting on my guy McMahon. You better watch out. He's gonna take you down in the Royal Rumble. All right, he's gonna get you on WWE and just knock you out, Mr. McMahon's son. No, I agree to an extent where I did feel like a lot of it, I was just reading a lot of different studies. And I thought they were like, to your point, they're interesting, but it was kind of hard to like discern the whole, like what's like the breadth of everything underneath this like title topic, you know? So I see where
Yeah.
you're coming from, Mike.
Yeah, it felt like it almost put the work on us to like, okay, here's all the different things I found, and now you take your conclusions instead of him synthesizing everything for us. Which again, there was a little bit of that at the end of each section, so maybe I'm just being needlessly picky. Another thing that I was thinking like potentially from this is if we're trying to get specific tendon adaptations. So I was thinking like for me clinically, I see a decent amount of Achilles tendinopathy and patellar tendinopathies. That so like how can I specifically work more of the tendon versus a muscle? It made me think about like I guess for patellar tendon as opposed to Achilles, just because I'm personally dealing with some patellar tendon stuff, so I want to get rid of it. Is could we just like work in high degrees of knee flexion to have a high strain, and then do like isometrics in high degrees of knee flexion to get
Using
further strain?
using like a relatively lower load, like how they said in the article, or like what?
Yes, yeah,
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and I guess
yeah.
how would you
But
be quantifying that then? I
Yeah.
guess you could.
I was thinking a couple different ways. It depends on what you have, right? Like you could use a Tyndec for that. I was honestly thinking like as simple as possible is just like using a pain scale. So like go into this position. Does it hurt just to go into like full knee flexion? If it hurts, um, then try pushing a little bit and then see what that does. I'd use essentially like 3 to 4 out of 10 pain would be allowable. And can you just continue to push into that? I don't really care how much force they're producing at that length. I care more about like if you do a couple rounds of an isometric like this, does it feel like you can push harder with similar amounts of pain? Does it stop hurting, or like does general pain decrease after doing that?
Do you think with going based on the pain scale, that you're not getting enough strain through the tendon? Because I feel like you could potentially have them do a 1 rep, like push into that, get I guess their current 100%, and then drop down to said amount of, because you have the technology available. So I feel like you could potentially do that instead. That way you're kind of finding that sort of right amount of force versus just subjective, because they're gonna have pain. And again, pain can be variable based on the person. But if you use pain, does that not elicit what you're kind of shooting for?
Yeah, which I like the quantification of it. My reason for not using um some sort of like a Tyndec or something would be I would want this to be a home exercise
Mm.
for people. So there's not really a good way for them to do that at home. Um, in theory, it could be something we do at clinic, and then at home, they could do, I guess, a similar, or they could do something like a Nordic quad exercise, where then they're going into further depths, and then they quantify it based on reps versus on like how much force they're putting through. Um, yeah, my only concern with like a Nordic quad, as opposed to some sort of way to, um, like, honestly, what I was just doing in my chair for this was just, like, go over to the side of my chair, have my knee bent, into, like, nearly knee flexion, then just push into the ground. So something like that versus, like, a Nordic quad is the Nordic quad has, like, compression to the patellar tendon as well because you're kneeling on it. So I don't know what that would do, either pain-wise or, to the tendon
Yeah,
cross-sectional area or anything.
but then at that point, could you just take like a towel, and like roll it up to a point to where you put it like right at the tibial tube area or just below it, so like their kneecaps are elevated.
Yeah,
So
could be.
right,
Could be, like, on a foam thing and have their tibia on the foam, and then their kneecaps are
like
off
floating
the
off.
foam. Yeah,
I think
um,
I thought you were gonna go with the direction of how when you do a Nordic, you're um relying a lot on like trunk, like
mhm,
you kind of need to have a strong whole trunk area to retain like a decent uh like I guess proper, but I guess if you can kind of jackknife it if you want, so then it's not like as hard, if that makes
yeah,
sense. Like you can be in more
mhm,
hip flexion to make it a little bit easier at first instead of retaining that perfectly neutral hip, but kind of much like how you would do like an actual hamstring Nordic.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
many many
it's
ways.
early, so I don't know if my brain is working at full capacity right now,
Oh,
and
oh,
you're even
oh yeah.
earlier than we
Oh
are.
yeah. The sun, for anyone watching, is just rising. And it's February, so take that in for what it's worth. Um uh what what was I gonna say on this topic? I had a point to what you were saying with the Tindec and such, but it is somehow fleeting me. So
Hmm,
I'm sad.
like, let's go back to what I was talking about. I was talking about, how it could be done. I wanna do this as a home exercise, so I wouldn't do it at home, or I wouldn't have them do, like, Tindex stuff at home. Did you get it?
right. No, but
Okay.
to to uh to your point of using like a pain scale, I think um pain never really was mentioned throughout this article, so I would be intrigued how that would build upon what was presented in here. Because from my understanding, with some article reviews looking at like utilizing pain, they didn't really see any significant outcomes when using like a 3 to 4 out of 10, or even like 0 to a 1, like that 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 subjective pain is really just individualized to where that person is probably going to get the most they're going to get out of it based on how comfortable they are pushing into that subjectivity.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of assumed it was in healthy individuals. A lot of
Yeah.
these articles just, I think he would have mentioned if it was more about pain than anything else. But I think what the article was trying to do is just look at like tendon stress, strain, stiffness versus like the therapeutic side of it.
Oh,
Like,
I remember what I was going to say. I got it now. What do you I feel like a lot of things talk about like muscle or tendon, and I don't feel like there's enough from my understanding of like that musculotendinous junction. Like what does that look like? How does that respond? What like there's got to be some different properties, cuz like it's not just like a clear cutoff, from like, oh, here's your tendon, here's your muscle. Like it's going to be a great gradient, and how does that respond? And like what I feel like sometimes that could be a pretty significant area, especially if we're talking about like hamstring strains, like those high hamstring strains. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a blend of different tissue types when it comes to that musculotendinous junction. Do I have any thoughts on what it does? I don't. But Pat, there's your PhD potentially.
Perfect. I'll put it on the whiteboard right now. Just musculotendinous. All right, Mike, you're gonna be my first subject. I'm gonna cut deep in your glute. I'm gonna take some of your high hamstring. Let me take that biopsy, baby.
Yeah, I would
Actually,
think that like the musculotendinous junction may experience greater strain, like greater relative deformation, because the muscle would not be as stiff as the tendon would be. So I could see like as it's like changing, I guess, percentage from like 100% muscle to 100% tendon, which I recognize isn't necessarily the case. But I could see when it's like, I don't know, 50-50, that it could be deforming a lot more than the true tendon would. But that's again totally spitting.
I was thinking, how do you think, I'm sure this isn't like ethical and no one can do it, but like a quad tendon repair where like someone's getting, not quad tendon repair, sorry. If someone is having a quad tendon autograft, just taking a little bit for a biopsy right there, but I know that's definitely not ethical to take something from someone in surgery potentially. I don't know how that works, but
just take a little bit extra and then just like take the other sliver, like, yep,
well,
this is mine now.
I would have to look into more, like, because I know there's a lot of different ways to do quad tendon grafts, but I would imagine that you would get some of that transference from muscle to tendon in that graft potentially. I'm sure they want all tendon, but I would find it hard to believe that's like 100% the case.
Well, I mean, there's two, like, I was just thinking about that. I believe there's two camps about tendons, is that the deformation doesn't happen actually at the tendon. It happens at probably the musculotendinous junction and the muscle when it comes to eccentrically loading. So that could be where you're getting more of the change in length is actually the muscle tendinous junction versus the actual tendon. I know that there's a couple Swedish researchers out there that's kind of, I think, who's the I'm drawing about Franz Bosch, that side of sort of the coin of that tendons are really stiff and the change in length is not necessarily from the tendon. It's just more from like other structures, including muscle versus like the muscle tendinous junction.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that could support my earlier
Right.
hypothesis. Cool. Did you guys have anything else on this article? I feel like there was like a whole bit about like the cellular changes at the tendon that we just skipped over because I don't know. I don't get it.
I feel like essentially it comes down to like the same, where it's like the Goldilocks syndrome. Do enough, you'll get good. Do too much, it's not good.
Right.
Yeah.
Or do not enough, it's not going to be good.
That also,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep. So yeah, I think that's another episode of Reading Rehab. As always, if you enjoyed and listened this far, please leave a nice review. Follow us on Instagram at Reading Rehab Pod. Yeah.